Hi there, and welcome again to Writing Techniques. In today's fifth presentation, we're going to take a look at two new development strategies, comparison and contrast, followed by analogy. We will begin with comparison and contrast, taking a look at them as a duo or pair. Of all the strategies used to develop effective writing, comparison and contrast are probably the ones you are most familiar with. Indeed, you were probably introduced to these two concepts as a child, simply because the best way to teach the new and unknown to someone is to compare it with what is known. For instance, when a child asks his parents, "What's a zebra?" parents usually answer, "A horse in striped pajamas," referring back to two elements the child is familiar with. Now, let's take a closer look at comparison and contrast. We will study them together because they are the two sides of a same coin. First, let's define both terms. Comparison, for one, is a technique that points out and explains similarities between two ideas, two concepts, two things, or two people. Contrast, on the other hand, explains differences. Most subjects lend themselves easily to comparison or contrast. Writers use both methods to emphasize a point, or to show the superiority of one thing over the other, or again, to explain something unfamiliar by comparing it to something familiar. In all these instances, the writer's aim is to catch the reader's attention. There are two types of comparisons and contrasts. They can be either literal or figurative. When you show the similarities and differences that exist between things of the same category, you are using a literal comparison or contrast. You could in this way compare or contrast unemployment rates in Canada with those in the United States, or compare and contrast the determination of the main characters in Tom Sawyer and Anne of Green Gables. The important thing with literal comparison is that both elements being compared belong to the same group. Now, when you show similarities and differences that exist between things of different categories, you are using figurative comparison or contrast. Let's say you were to compare the writing process to building a stone wall, or union management negotiations to a game of chess. This is figurative comparison or contrast because the two elements of the comparison belong to different groups. Whether your comparison or contrast is literal or figurative, the important thing to remember is that in order to compare two things effectively, you need a basis of comparison or contrast. This basis will tell you which similarities and differences you should focus on in developing your text. For example, if you are asked to compare the rehabilitation process in Canadian and Chilean prisons, you have been given a basis of comparison, the rehabilitation process. This means you will develop your comparison by looking at the different elements related to the rehabilitation process in both countries' prisons, and show how they are similar or different. So, the important thing to remember here is to clearly determine the basis of your comparison before you start to write. Let's say you want to compare two cars, the Mazda and the Toyota. This can reveal itself a very general subject that could cover pages and pages of text. Before you start writing anything, you should narrow down your subject and choose a specific base of comparison. Reliability, looks, performance, resale possibilities, etc. Your purpose and audience will help you determine the appropriate basis for your comparison. If you are writing a report for your insurance company, you might decide to choose performance. But if you're writing a report for the consumer, then, or potential buyer, you might choose looks, or again, reliability. You might decide to choose more than one basis, but if so, make sure you have sufficient information about both cars, the Mazda and the Toyota, to develop an effective text where similarities and differences will stand out clearly. Sometimes the basis of the comparison or contrast might not be all that obvious. Let's say you have to compare the education system in Canada with the education system in France. You would have to consider many aspects about the two systems before determining the general similarity or difference to use as a basis of comparison. When the basis of comparison is not obvious, you can proceed as follows. First, make a parallel list of the similarities and differences of your subject. Although you might find this time-consuming at first, you'll soon discover that it's time well spent. It will ensure that you have sufficient material, that you are comparing equivalent aspects of your subject, and that you are giving the same information about both. Let's say you were writing about house pets, and you decided to compare cats and dogs. You could compile these two lists. Cats, for one, can be left alone for long periods, groom themselves, don't need to be walked, and are self-sufficient. Dogs, on the other hand, cannot be left alone for long periods, have to be groomed regularly, need to be walked, and need their master's affection. Second, these parallel lists will allow you to determine what the similarities and differences have in common. In other words, you will now be able to choose the basis of your comparison. From the lists we've just mentioned, you could choose the animal's character, the animal's needs, or the owner's responsibilities. Let's say you choose the animal's character as a basis of comparison. You are now ready for the third step, that is, deciding upon your thesis statement or topic sentence. If you are simply exposing facts, you could choose to state the basis of your comparison this way. Cats and dogs have very different personalities. However, if you were using persuasive writing, you would probably want to convey your own attitude or opinion about the animal's character, and your topic sentence might look something like this. Cats are very independent animals, but dogs, on the other hand, are quite dependent upon their masters. Fourth, you would be ready to begin the comparison or contrast of cats and dogs. There are two ways to organize and structure comparison and contrast. The first method consists of developing one side of the comparison or contrast completely, and then proceeding with the other side, making sure that you present the details of both sides in exactly the same order. This is called the block method, and the outline of this structure would look like this. You'd have a topic sentence. Cats are very independent animals, but dogs are quite dependent upon their masters. Followed by a breakdown where you would have a first paragraph on cats that can be left alone, groom themselves, that don't need to be walked, and are self-sufficient. This would then be followed by another paragraph on dogs who can't be left alone, need to be groomed, need to be walked, and need love and affection. The second method of developing comparison and contrast is to alternate between the subjects being compared, discussing them under common headings. This means you shift back and forth between the two subjects. This method is called the alternating method, and the outline would look something like this. Same topic sentence. Cats are very independent animals, but dogs are quite dependent upon their masters. But then you would break down as follows. Being alone, comparing cats and dogs. Grooming, cats and dogs. Exercise, again comparing cats and dogs. And finally, the subject love and affection, cats, and dogs.